The whistle blew as I stood up from my resting place next to the chain-link fence that enclosed the area where I, along with 20 other men, was getting my daily ration of fresh air. I kept as far away from the other cons as I could since I was not going to blow my chance of getting out by getting into trouble. Freedom was just too damned close for me to screw it up. I ambled over toward the far edge of the field and queued up with the other inmates, waiting to file into the outer chamber leading from the exercise field to the main hallway of the prison. My name is Carmine Montoya, and I'm a charter member of the Inmates Society here at lovely Ohio State Penitentiary. I'm one of over 500 held courtesy of the state of Ohio. I'm in for assault and serving a sentence of 7 to 10 years. Actually, it was a plea bargain that got me here, but I was guilty. No question about it. I admitted it, and my attorney worked out the deal. He was court-appointed, but he did the job. He was happy that I had no complaints and wanted no appeal. I just wanted to serve my time and pay my debt to society. We had 2 hours a day outside, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. This was the second, and the whistle signaled our hour and the sun was over. When the last man came through the sally port, the steel bar gate slammed shut behind him. The clang was one I was familiar with now, and it was just part of the background noise. Once it was shut, the gate in front of the first man in the queue slid open, and we filed into the main hallway. I looked down the long, sterile hallway, cells to the right and left, 2 levels high and most now filled, and thought to myself that this had been my home for the last 5 years and some days. We were the last group of the day to go outside. As always, we marched single file down that barren walk with guards at the head and the end of our column and one walking beside. No talking, no nothing, just silent marching, the sound of our prison-issue shoes echoing from the block walls. My group was on the ground floor, so we marched down the center, men peeling off in pairs to the left or right to enter their cells. The doors were all open, waiting for the command to shut them down. I was near the end and followed Owen, Big O Potts, my current cellmate, as we moved out of line and into cell number 113. Owen jumped up to the top bunk while I took the bottom due to my seniority in this cell. The guard came past, looked in to see we were where we were supposed to be and that no one else was in with us. Then, after checking the full row, signaled to the gatekeeper. Once all were in and accounted for, the doors slid home with their own distinctive clang, and we were sealed in for the next 2 hours until the dinner march. So, tomorrow's the day, Doc? Owen was not much in the way of words, but this was a special occasion. Yeah, tomorrow's the day. Oh, gonna be good to be out of here. I didn't normally say much either, which is why Owen and I were good cellmates. He had been with me for over a year now, without either of us doing the other harm. Yeah, good. You got my number, Doc? I'm out in another month. I got it. I just hope I don't need it until parole is done. We were done talking until dinner. Silence was one of the premiums in a good cellmate. None of us liked to talk much after a few years inside. After all, when your world consisted of a barren cell and a cot with a stainless steel crapper, what was there to talk about? Most of the movies they showed were ancient, and the library held mainly rejected books from the local schools. Not a lot of stimulation. Owen Potts is in for manslaughter. He took a dislike to a man that threatened one of his kids. Seems the man also was messing with his missus, and Owen took issue with that. He put a knife into the guy's gut, just missing an artery. Fortunately, the guy survived, so Owen only got 15 years. His wife divorced him, and he hadn't seen his kid for the last 10 years. Shortly after he was released from the hospital, the guy on the outside was mugged and killed in what the police called a random case of robbery. Funny, but it wasn't a surprise to Owen. All he said when he heard was, "Good job." He had already done most of his time, and like me, the parole board gave him a pass on the remainder. He'd kept his nose clean inside. It's good that society doesn't like to shell out good money for more and better prisons. Makes our time a lot shorter. I lay back, picking up the book I had been reading. It was a medical journal, and it outlined several new procedures for resetting and aligning broken bones. I had kept up with the new procedures and discoveries in prison, and the librarian was good about getting the books I requested. I picked it up, looked at it for a few minutes, then put it down. I wanted something less technical and more exciting. I picked up a fiction novel, one of Ludlum's tomes, always good for reading since it took forever to finish one. Deep, dark, convoluted, and violent. Just the thing for a convict to waste time with. I had read all of his works that were in the prison library. My release was coming just in time. I had been in jail now for 5 years, 3 months and 10 days. With the overcrowding in the state penal system, the courts had ruled that once a prisoner had served 70% of his minimum term, he or she was eligible for parole. The parole board had granted my parole on the 3rd try. No one showed up to protest or to advocate for my release since I had made it clear I wanted no one I knew to know about my upcoming parole hearing. I asked only one man to speak on my behalf. I hadn't asked anyone else for my side, and no one ever appeared for the other one, so it was pretty much of a wash in that regard. But this time I had a guarantee of a job and a place to live when I got out, courtesy of my old boss and friend, Jason Watley. He ran a private practice now in Columbus and wanted me to come in with him. He had made the necessary calls, and my license to practice had been renewed without issue since my crime had nothing to do with medicine and I had passed the proficiency test. The parole board liked this, and the letter from Jason was complimentary, so they relented and gave me parole. During the time I was in, my only visitor was my sister Eileen. She was married and had 3 kids of her own. She and her husband Fred moved into our parents' home in the suburbs of Cleveland after they were both killed in a car accident 3 years ago. Before that, Mom and Dad wanted to come visit, but I begged them both to stay away. I hated for them to see me in here, but Mom had to come anyway. She and Eileen both came every couple of months until her death. Dad sent letters but honored my request. I think the whole idea pained him. However, they were gone now, and only Eileen came. We never talked of my ex and my kid. Eileen learned early on that I wanted no word of what they were doing. I had it in my head that they were better off without me. After all, I had lost it big time when I almost killed Hugo. I don't think I would have done anything to Nancy, but I wasn't sure. So I decided to put them in my past and move on. It seemed the best thing for all of us. When she visited a week ago, I told Eileen of my deal with Jason, and she was delighted. We promised to keep in touch after I was released. She asked if I had a place to stay and needed anything. I told her Jason had everything under control, so not to worry. As soon as I was settled, I would call her and give her the information. Laying on my bunk and considering all of this, I sighed and tried to take a quick nap. Time seemed to be dragging even more slowly now than it did normally. All I had to do now was make it through dinner, and then one more night in this hellhole, and I would be a free man. Free from what? Well, that was a matter of public record, so there's no harm in telling you. It was all because I beat a man almost to death. It was a close call, but he survived and I was arrested and charged with assault with intent to kill. My court-appointed attorney helped me to a plea bargain that reduced the charge to simple assault. I was guilty and was willing to plead out, so it went through without a trial. I agreed to a term of not less than 7 and not more than 10 years if I would plead guilty. It was all very civilized, and I was bundled off to jail and out of sight of all those who wanted me lynched or acquitted. Seems at the time, there were more on the lynching side, but who was counting? What happened? It was a very simple thing. I was a doctor on staff at a local hospital. I was a specialist and my practice was in the field of orthopedics, a bone doctor, and I had been on call for almost 18 hours when I clocked out for the day and went down to the wards. I had a patient on the ward that I wanted to visit before I went home. As is the way of things, during the time I was in house, there was a serious accident and I was called to help. I worked trauma for the next 5 hours before an emergency surgery had to be performed on a man who could lose the use of his leg if it wasn't rebuilt properly. Since I was already there, I was paged and was in surgery for almost 6 more hours with him before I could get away by switching with a colleague of mine. I had been on duty now for over 30 straight hours. I got a colleague of mine to take my next shift since I would be too tired to be effective, and he agreed. I got out of the hospital before any more could happen and got in my car to drive home. I had called my wife earlier to tell her I was going to be delayed, but that I would call if I could get away before my next scheduled shift. I hadn't remembered to call Nancy before I left, letting her know that I had switched, so I tried now. I called her cell phone just to be sure and got her voicemail and left a message saying I was heading home. It was just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so I expected her to be home anyway. She worked part-time for a real estate company as a receptionist, but wouldn't be working today. I wasn't scheduled home until later that evening, so since she hadn't received my call, she would assume I was on shift now. I pulled into the drive, noticing that a strange car was already there. I had no idea who it could be. I thought maybe it was a friend who stopped by since Nancy was home. I dragged myself into the house, my mind clouded by fatigue after almost 30 straight hours of working. I looked around the kitchen and the rest of downstairs and found nobody home. My muddled brain concluded that they must be out shopping or some such. Without any further thought, I headed for the steps, my body barely making its way up the stairs to the bedroom and the shower. That's all I wanted now. A nice long, hot shower and then a few hours in bed, all alone, by myself. Heaven. I walked into the bedroom and was met with a sight that remained burned into my retinas for years. It's been over 5 years now, but if I try real hard, I can still see my wife on the bed, her legs spread and a man laying on top of her and moving up and down between her legs. There was remarkably little sound, but I do remember the little rhythmic squeak the bed made as he bounced up and down. I remember it was eek, 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 or something like that. That sound, like the sight, was also burned into my memory. I don't know what I thought at that instant, but I didn't say a word. All I can remember is turning away and walking out of the room. At this point, it all becomes a little blurry. I tried to remember it later, but it was as if it happened to someone else and I was too tired to watch. All I know is that they said I went out of the room, got a baseball bat out of my son's room, and then came back to the bedroom where my wife Nancy and her boss and lover Hugo Bintz were still in the process of screwing each other to death. I hit Hugo on the back with the bat, and then when he noticed me, I swung it again, hitting him in the side, breaking several ribs, jamming one into his lung. It then appears I continued to beat him with the bat until my wife jumped on me, knocking me down. I apparently got up and tried to push her away before she ran out of the room into our son's room and locked the door. She called 911, and they came shortly after. They found me sitting in the family room, staring off into space, the bat still in my hands and covered in blood. When they asked me if I was all right, I couldn't answer. I just dropped the bat and stood up. I wasn't aware of anything at that point. Whatever was driving me before was gone. I couldn't respond when they asked me my name or anything else. My brain fried. I remained that way for days afterward. Hugo was still upstairs in our bed, unconscious. He was taken to the emergency room, and I guess it was touch and go for a while before they got him stabilized. I had given him a concussion, broken several bones in his arms and legs, and a couple of ribs. I was told later that he needed multiple surgeries, but he recovered with no complications. Nancy was not hurt, and she told the police what happened. Since Hugo was there with my wife's permission, the state decided to charge me since I had attacked him while there as my wife's guest. Can you beat that? My wife invited him over to screw her in my house and in my bed, and I was the bad guy. The first I remember is sitting in a small room with a very serious man asking me questions. I woke up, looked at him strangely, then began to respond normally. At that point, a policeman came in, handcuffed me, and I was arraigned and charged with felony assault. That all happened several days later. I had been in a hospital, unresponsive for all that time, but now I was magically cured, and I could pay for my crimes. Nancy tried to talk to me while I was in jail waiting trial, but I refused to see her. She tried to post bail, but I refused, and I refused her attempt to hire a lawyer. I asked and was given a court-appointed attorney. He told me that the state was a little anxious about their case since Nancy refused to testify against me, so they were willing to deal. I told him that I wanted to plead guilty, which caused him to begin to argue with me, but I refused to discuss it any further and told him to work it out. He wanted to know why I would do something so insane. His word, not mine. I let him rant and rave until he seemed to have worn himself out, and then I calmly explained it to him. I understood that my wife had cheated on me with the man I almost killed. I knew that I was impaired in my judgment, and, with my wife's unwillingness to testify against me, that meant that I could probably get off. But, and this was important to me and my sense of who I was, I had almost killed a man in anger, and, for that, I insisted that I pay. And anyway, what was I going to go home to? A wife who was dissatisfied with me as a husband. A son who would be so disappointed in his father that he would come to hate me for what I had done. He listened, shaking his head over and over, but in the end, it was my decision and not his, and I chose my fate. When they arraigned me, I pleaded guilty. The judge asked me a bunch of questions as if I were a moron, and finally accepted my plea. Sentencing was scheduled, and I told my lawyer to go for a deal. He was a good lawyer with a good heart, so he did as I asked. I think he still tried to get me the best deal he could, so it wasn't all bad. Once I was sent to jail, I refused all attempts for Nancy to see me. I sent her a short note telling her never to try to see me or to bring my 9-year-old son to see me. I would refuse to see him as well, and I told her why. I never wanted him to see where I was living. That would hurt me more than anything else would. For my son to see his father behind bars and in a place like this. One of the reasons I pled guilty and accepted the plea deal was so as to eliminate the humiliation to my wife and son. I promised myself that what I did would never reflect on them. It was my crime and my sin, and I would pay for it. My first year in jail was a real nightmare, but I got lucky. They paired me with a man by the name of Bruno Canseco. He was in for murder, and he was a lifer. He learned I was a doctor in my other life and took a liking to me. He said we could do pretty well if I was to offer medical advice, letting him handle me as my agent. I refused initially, but after the first beating, when I looked wrong at someone, I agreed, and he took it from there. Soon after, using my medical knowledge, I made a few friends, became known and respected, and generally left alone. Bruno and I shared the spoils of my consulting fee, which usually consisted of cigarettes, sugar candy of any kind, magazines with women, and the like. We did pretty well, and I became well off. Bruno was transferred sometime after to a max security jail someplace else, and I was on my own. But I was okay by that time and knew the ropes, so I survived. After that first year in jail, I was notified that Nancy was filing for divorce. She requested a meeting with me, but instead, I sent her a note. I refused to see her and congratulated her on her new life with Loverboy. I told her to write her own terms and I would sign without contesting it. I just wanted it over and done with, and she could have it all. The house, the cars, the clothes and jewelry. We had a nice bank account at the time which should last her long enough to collect on the insurance policy I kept that covered her and my son in the event I was unable to work for any reason. I had no desire to contest it, since I knew from the minute my fatigued brain took over that day that my marriage was over. I would miss my son, but that was as it should be. No son should ever have to see his father in prison, or to have a jailbird as a father. That was just wrong on so many levels. All of that happened years ago now, and I was able to forget most of it. I spent a little time with the prison shrink, and I actually found myself able to forgive Nancy for what she did to me. He told me that forgiveness was not for her benefit, but for mine. He was right. I remember feeling so much better after that. I sometimes went for weeks without thinking of my previous life, but I never stopped remembering both my son and my wife. It's funny that I never stopped loving either one of them, even after what she did to me. In my memory, her cheating faded and I remembered the good times. I think that spending so much time alone made the good times much better and the bad times a little less bad. I think that was true. Anyway, the day of my release came, and believe it or not, I had a few bad moments saying goodbye to some of the other guests of our beloved OSP. Oh, and of course, Tiny, who saved my life a couple of times early on. Benny Five Fingers, Tony T, Pan, Willie, and several others. I had spent the past 3 years working in the hospital, and I had treated many of the other cons. I did save Benny's life by diagnosing a tumor, and Tiny got a reduced sentence on appeal after I told his lawyer I found a hormone imbalance that caused some of his behavior problems. I was leaving, but my contacts with him were some of the ones I would cherish in later years. These friends were the ones that would remain regardless of what happened to me. We had been through hell together, and that was a bond no one could break. Their friendship was honest and based on mutual respect, unlike many in the outside world. I collected my few meager belongings and was escorted out of the gates and released just outside the entrance. The sound of that big chain-link fence slamming shut behind me was unique, and I turned to see the source. Freedom. It was the sound of freedom. I watched the guard come over and throw the bar that locked it. He raised one hand in salute, and I returned it. Funny, even the guards were friends in that strange sort of way. I blinked in the bright sunshine and saw Jason waiting for me in a bright red Cadillac CTS. He waved. I walked slowly toward him, walking like most cons, my shoulders hunched up, subconsciously expecting a bullet in the back. He grabbed me in a bear hug and pushed me into the car. He got back in, put the car in gear, and I left the OSP behind me. I never looked back. That was 6 months ago now, and I was back in practice in Jason's clinic in Columbus, Ohio. We did only high-profile cases, working mainly in the area of reconstruction, and the money was wonderful. I was already making more than I had ever had before, and I was adjusting to living free again without looking over my shoulder every time I wanted to do something or go somewhere. It was hard at first, jumping at every loud sound or ducking whenever I heard someone shout, but it was getting easier. I always looked around when I went into a building and looked for the exits, and I still had difficulty looking directly into someone's eyes. When I was on the inside, the guards took that as a threat, and we were instructed to look at our feet when talking to one of them. The only restriction on my freedom was that I had to physically report in every 2 weeks to my parole officer, but he told me that it wouldn't be too long before he let me slide and just make random visits. He had all my information, my address, and my work number. I was his for the next 2 years, which meant that I had to remain nearby for that same period. But otherwise, it was freedom and more than I had for the last 5 years. I took the first month's money and found a small apartment on the outskirts of the downtown area. The rent was cheap since it was in a rundown neighborhood, but the apartment was large and had a lot of windows. It was full of light, and that's all I cared about. It had 2 big bedrooms and a full kitchen, but that wasn't too important to me. I just needed a microwave to nuke some frozen dinners and I was fine. I had enough to swing the first and last, and some left over to buy a mattress and some blankets, as well as a whole lot of cans and frozen dinners. The rest of the furniture would come later as I got more money. I was used to a cot, a stainless steel john, and a wash basin. This place was heaven to me. I moved in and made it home. Over the next few months, I bought more stuff from yard sales and ads in the paper for miscellaneous. That was fine for me. The need for expensive toys and goodies was gone, prison putting it in its proper perspective. By the end of 5 months, I had a real bed, a dresser and a chest, a couch, a TV, and a kitchen table with 3 chairs. The second bedroom was empty, and I had no need to fill it. I was satisfied and settled in. I let Eileen know where I was and gave her my new phone number, and she promised to keep in touch. She wanted to know what my plans were, but all I told her was that I wanted to let myself get used to dealing with normal people again and doing the job I was hired to do. The rest would come with time. When I was fully settled and found myself bored, I got hold of a contact that Tiny gave me before I left. Tiny was from Mansfield, a town not too far from Columbus, and he had a lot of contacts in the outside world. One was a PI, and I called him to locate my ex-wife and my son. I just wanted to know where they were and what name they were using. I had no desire for anything more at this time. We met. I gave him my last address, her name and SS number, and my son's name. I didn't know what last name she was using now, so I left it up to him. In less than a week, he came up with all of the information I had requested. He filled me in, shook my hand, and refused my money, saying, "You're a friend of Tiny's, so your money's no good here. I know what you did for him. Anything else you want to know, you call? I'll get it for you." I thanked him and watched him walk away. Prison. Not something I would recommend, but the friends I made in there were friends for life, and the benefits more than anyone in the outside world could imagine. I would make use of some of them later. When I got home to my apartment, I nuked a meatloaf and mashed potato dinner, took it over to the small table that I had located right next to a full wall of windows, and sat down with my envelope. I opened it and read what the PI found. Nancy Montoya, age 35. Son, Ruben Montoya, age 14. Address, see attached with local phone number. No phone listed for Ruben. Interesting that she hadn't changed her name. I guess it was to keep the same name as our son. I was surprised that she hadn't remarried and that no one had adopted Ruben. She was a gorgeous woman, one most men noticed, and could have any man she wanted. Maybe she was just living with one now. I took a bite of the meatloaf, telling myself that I didn't really care, and continued. Ms. Montoya and son lived together in a small bungalow in a subdivision of Groveport. There are no others living in the home, and Ms. Montoya works at a veterinary clinic in Groveport proper. Ruben goes to school in Groveport and is in the 9th grade. There is no record of any civil or criminal activity for either Ms. Montoya or the boy. No known associates for Ms. Montoya. No male friends, but she does go out with several female friends. Names are available. Ruben has many contacts, but one, Eddie Clemens, also 14, is frequently at the residence. Ruben also stays with Clemens on occasion. Bank records show a modest savings account, a checking account with normal activity, and only one credit card. Current balance is $235.67. Current savings account is $154,000 and checking account is $1,233.90. Public records show a sale of property in Brentwood subdivision of Southern Columbus 3 years ago, with proceeds deposited in a local bank. Transferred funds later into a separate account and to current bank account. No record under known SS numbers for the second account. Could find out more if you request. Our home was worth a lot more than that, and it didn't have a mortgage. I really couldn't remember much about that time, so I just accepted the figures. It made no difference to me anyway. I gave her everything in the divorce. I wanted to leave that house and all its memories behind forever. It was rare that I saw flashes of Hugo on top of Nancy now, and even those were fleeting. I didn't even feel the pain now. I guess the isolation for the past 5 years washed it all away. In curiosity, I tried to remember that afternoon but got nothing but vague images. No emotion at all. I put the envelope aside and finished my meal. I washed it down with a Diet Pepsi, my drink of choice now, and settled down for an evening of TV. I was surprised when I looked at TVs to find those widescreens. I was so impressed that I bought one for myself. It was the only luxury I gave into, but that was my choice as well. I wanted nothing more than to be left alone. No bars, no chance of fights, no restaurants or cafes, nowhere there were more than 2 or 3 people at a time, at least for the first 2 years. It was slow becoming used to people again, and I was not in any rush. After an unusually busy month, I found that my share of the partnership was large enough to buy myself some transportation. I debated on what to get and settled on a used Ford pickup that I paid cash for. The idea of driving a truck took my fancy and I was pleased. I guess my past life was completely gone and the new me was beginning to establish himself. Actually, the new me was a completely different person now. I thought that was a good change, but time would tell. The next year went by with nothing unusual happening. I had continued to furnish my small apartment with items and now had a second bedroom that was furnished with the usual. I also bought some items for my pickup, like a new radio and new tires, but that was the extent of my purchases. I had begun to branch out and went to a few of the local cafes for the occasional lunch or dinner. A real man about town. Life was good and I began to feel safe. Things were predictable. This was also good. Then I got a phone call from my parole officer. I was sitting at home as usual watching the TV when he called. "Carmine, this is Jack, your parole officer." "Christ, Jack, I know your voice by now. You call every damned month. What the hell do you want? It isn't time for me to report in yet, and anyway, you know where I spend my time. Hey, is my parole up yet?" "Calm down, Carmine. You're still mine for the next 2.5 months, then you're on your own." Reason I called, I got a call today. From someone you know. They're looking to contact you. Do you want to know who it was? Sure. One of the boys from OSP? You know I can't talk to them, you prick. You're just trying to catch me in a violation, aren't you? USOB? You just don't want to let me go. That's not nice, Jack. You, shithead. It was your boy, Ruben. He's the one that called. He found out you got out of prison, and he's been trying to contact you. Left me a number after I told him I'd have to talk to you first. You don't have any restrictions against talking to family. I know you have him, your ex, your sister and her brood, and a couple of aunts and uncles. My son? Ruben was looking for me? Damn. What the hell do I do now, Jack? What the hell did I do was right. I haven't seen Ruben for over 5.5, hell, almost 6.5 years now. He would be a teenager, grown up. What could I say to him? He's your son, you idiot. You'll know what to say to him as soon as he opens his mouth. That's what parents do, you know? They talk to their kids. Usually talk way too much to the kids if you ask them. All he wants is to talk to his dad, the one he hasn't seen or talked to for a long damn time. I am an ex-con, and why would he want to talk to me? A parolee. Why would a kid want a dad like that? It makes no sense. This was causing me to sweat. My hands started to shake, and it was hard to catch my breath. I recognized it as a panic attack. How'd he find you, Jack? How'd he know where to look? I didn't even tell anyone except Jason and my sister that I was getting out. Seems your parole was mentioned in the local paper. Local doc gets parole. Or some shit like that. He saw it, or someone else saw it and told him. What's the difference? Shit, I hadn't thought about that. Now it was common knowledge. I wondered if the other kids gave him shit. Probably. Little peckers. What's the deal? Do I call him? Or do you call him? And what number did he give you? I didn't think he had a cell phone. Seems he bought his own prepaid. His mom doesn't know about that one. She seems pretty protective according to what he told me. Tough but fair, he says. Anyway, I'll give you the number he left. The rest is up to you. That's what I told him already, so if you call him, fine. If not, he understands it's your choice. I wrote down the number, then hung up and just stared at the TV. Ruben, my son. It was one of the parts of the divorce and the jail sentence I hated. That I couldn't see my own son. I know it was my choice, but I didn't feel I had any other. He couldn't see his father stuck in a prison. Not a chance. I had caused him and his mother enough grief with my actions. He didn't need to remember me as a con. When I made the decision to cut all ties, it was for two reasons. First, I couldn't forget what I saw that day, and I knew that I would have a hard time forgiving Nancy, so a clean break was the best thing for both of us. I didn't want her trying to convince me that she loved me, or that it was a mistake, or any of that stuff. Why embarrass herself? There was no need. It was obviously over between us, so let it die. The second was that a public trial would come back to haunt both of them for a long time afterwards. There would be press coverage of a trial, people judging all of us, my son subjected to ridicule and harassment, the details of my wife's affair public for all to see, and finally, the fact that I went nuts would impact both of them. The way I did it, without a trial and without publicity, was cleaner, kinder, and quicker for my wife. A clean break for him too. Afterwards, it took me all of the time I spent in prison to forget, but sometime during those years, I did. Even now, the thrill of seeing my son again was all I could think about. Nancy was not an issue. I knew that I still loved her and probably always would, but she was part of my past now, and she would have moved on with someone else. She had begun her new life without me, and she was better off if I stayed out of it. I thought about it for several days, but I knew that I was going to call him. I also knew that my simple, safe life was about to change. Let's listen the story from Nancy's perspective. My name is Nancy Montoya. My ex-husband Carmine is in prison for assaulting a man and almost killing him with a baseball bat. It was my fault that it happened, but Carmine paid the price for it. I tried to help him when he was charged, but he wouldn't let me. As a matter of fact, he refused to even talk to me when he was waiting for trial. I tried to bail him out, but he refused to be released. I then hired an attorney, one of the best around, but Carmine refused him as well. He got a court-appointed attorney. Before I even knew what happened, Carmine accepted a plea bargain and went off to prison. We have a son, Ruben, who was just 9 when all this happened. The worst part was that Carmine refused to allow his son to see him in jail and then later in prison. He refused to see either of us, ever. He sent me a note, a short one, where he told me to keep Ruben away. I decided to divorce him a year later, hoping to get him to talk to me, to reconsider, but he refused again. This time the note he sent told me how much I had hurt him. I gave up, knowing I couldn't reach him and that he would never forgive me. I didn't blame him then, and I still don't. I never forgave myself. I still remember what happened as if it were yesterday. I still cry myself to sleep sometimes even now, almost 6 years later. I get so lonely sometimes that I want to do something, go somewhere, be with someone. But I won't. I refuse to be happy, to enjoy my freedom while he is in jail. I put him there, and if he has to endure being alone, so will I. It isn't as difficult as it sounds, because what I did to him is what I can't forget. That day, that horrible day, when Carmine called to tell me he was held over at the hospital, I have to say I was angry. I didn't let on to him, of course. It was his fault I was angry. After all, he was the one that wouldn't take the job at that fancy clinic. They wanted him to come in as a reconstruction specialist. Carmine was a genius at facial reconstruction. When someone was in an accident and their face was crushed and twisted, they wanted Carmine to be their doctor. Everyone said so. Carmine told me about the offer a month ago, and I was excited about it. He talked about the money, the hours that would be scheduled to fit into a normal life, unlike those at the hospital emergency room where he was on call a week out of every month. I said we could live a normal life for a change. He knew that was what I wanted, what I dreamed of. I knew how much he loved the trauma ward, the emergencies that he attended, the battered lives he saved, and that was in his blood, and it made him happy, but I wanted him to put us first. I wanted him to take the offer in the worst way. I loved him so much that I knew it would not be his first choice. Not for him a routine job, fixing those who could afford the exorbitant prices the clinic charged. No emergencies, no sad people who were so disfigured they would live a life of shame. That life would bore him. No, not for my Carmine. But if I had to choose between having him home more often and making more money and him doing something that made him happy, I had no choice. I had to choose time with his family. Carmine was by nature a happy person, and that was one of the things I loved most about him, but I would rather have him home with Ruben and I. We could also make him happy. We talked about it, weighed the pros and cons, and he finally made the decision. I voted for him to take it, but he didn't agree. I knew he was pleased at the choice he made, and I tried to convince myself that it was best that he be happy. I loved him and he was happy. What more could I ask for? Indeed, I asked myself then, what more could I ask for? How naive was I? That was a week before the phone call that morning. Carmine had just finished a long shift, but was due home to take me to the mall to do some shopping for Ruben. School was starting soon and Ruben needed some new jeans and shirts. I wanted to go and Carmine promised to go with me. Ruben and I were still asleep when he called to tell me about the emergency and that he had to stay. He was in such a hurry that I didn't have time to remind him about the shopping, so I just let it go. But the frustration was there, and it was eating at me as I did some laundry. This had happened several times in the last few weeks, and I was angry about it. This was what I had warned him about when he turned down the clinic job. As I sorted the whites and the colors, I thought again about the job offer. God, it would have been perfect. Exactly what I wanted. More time, more money, more prestige. All those things we both talked about when we married. Carmine was a wonderful specialist, and he was free to take most any assignment he wanted. But when he chose, he always leaned toward the action, the emergencies, the excitement. I finally accepted that it was who he was. But the question nagged at me. Why couldn't he choose us, me and Ruben, over the excitement? Why not us first? I had to admit, it really bothered me. Usually I wouldn't ask myself that, wouldn't think that way, but today my mind was not feeling so forgiving. I was bored. I hadn't seen Carmine for almost 28 hours, and since he hadn't called later, he must have decided to work his regular shift and then come home later this evening for 2 days off. I guess it made sense, but I was still pissed. I was talking to myself when the doorbell rang. I pushed the start button on the washer and went to answer. I opened the door to see Hugo Bentz, my boss at the real estate office. He was holding some folders, and he looked frazzled. I invited him in, closed the door behind him, and led him into the family room. "What's up, Hugo? What have you got there? You look like you're not happy." Hugo held the folders out to me with a smile. "Can I ask you for a favor? Can you type the offers for me so that I can have them tomorrow morning? It would mean a great deal to me. I'll pay you the overtime." I took the folders, glanced in, and saw that they were routine offers, nothing special. I wondered why no one else could do this simple task, but put it out of my mind. I quickly agreed and put the folders down on the end table next to me. "Sure, Hugo, no problem. I'll have them done by morning." I chatted with Hugo for a few minutes, enjoying the break and the company. To extend the visit even a little, I asked him if he wanted a beer. He quickly agreed. I got a couple and we sat down and began talking. I had always liked Hugo, and we often flirted with each other in the office just in fun. Today seemed like any other day, and we joked back and forth, flirted outrageously, and had another beer. I began to relax, having fun with a man I worked with. Nothing else. To this day, all I can remember is that I started telling Hugo about my frustration with Carmine and his job. The story was dragging out, so I made us a couple of mixed drinks, heavy on the booze, the small buzz helping the telling of the tale. Hugo listened, made some comments about leaving someone as beautiful as me alone so much and how he would never do that. I was flattered, and when he moved closer to me on the couch, I didn't even mind. When he put his arm around my shoulder to soothe me when I said something in anger, I didn't mind. When I stood, almost crying about the frustration and the loneliness that I felt when Carmine worked these long hours, I didn't mind when he took me in his arms and held me tight against him. I felt his erection pressing into my stomach, but I didn't say anything. We stood like that for a few minutes before I put my arms around his neck and tilted my face upward. He didn't hesitate, pressing his lips against mine, his tongue probing against my lips. I opened and accepted him inside. When Hugo led me up the stairs to my bedroom, talking softly to me and rubbing my back with one hand, I didn't say anything. My mind was listening to his words, and my stomach was fluttering with desire at the contact from his hand on my back. I knew this was wrong, that I was flirting with danger, but I didn't stop what we were doing. I was stupid and foolish, but I was so tired, so frustrated, still angry at Carmine. I was alone so much, without his warmth and his touch. I knew what I was doing was dangerous, but I felt so in control. I didn't even notice that the alcohol warmed my stomach and lowered my normal inhibitions. All I wanted was some companionship. Carmine had chosen his work over me, and now I was going to do something about it. That's all I wanted until it began to be something else. And I didn't stop it. I didn't stop it. Even now, after I understood the consequences and the damage I did to all of us, I still didn't know why I didn't stop. Hugo unzipped the back of my house dress and pulled it away from my shoulders. It fell to the floor, leaving me in my plain cotton bra and panties. I was staring at his face, so close to mine as I felt my bra slip free. As his lips pressed against mine so softly I wasn't even sure he had kissed me, he unbuckled his pants and pushed them down. He pushed me to sit on the bed, naked and unresisting. I knew it was going to happen. I wanted to say something, anything, but I was too immersed in lust now to do anything other than allow what was happening. As Hugo started pleasing me, now it was simply feeling, and I wanted this to happen. If this was wrong, I would face that later. It was now that was important, and only now. There was me and my body and he and his body. Nothing else mattered. Nothing else. Hugo drove inside me. I was feeling a growing surge that would eventually lead to an orgasm if Hugo could continue long enough to bring me there. As Hugo plunged in and out, my mind began to work, albeit slowly and sluggishly. This was wrong. This was Hugo, my boss, not my Carmine. What was I doing? I wanted to stop, to resist, but the feeling was growing between my legs and up into my stomach. A climax was coming. I stopped thinking again, my lust taking control once more. Just as I felt my climax begin to take over, Hugo jerked violently and stopped pushing into me. I opened my eyes to see why he had stopped and saw a flash of metal as it struck Hugo on the back of the head. Hugo yelled, rolled off me. I saw Carmine standing at the side of the bed, his face a twisted caricature of his normal appearance, so different I almost didn't recognize him. He had the bat, and as I watched, startled, he swung it again at Hugo, catching him in the side. Hugo screamed again, and I rolled off the bed on the side away from Carmine. As I stood there, frightened and unsure what to do, Carmine swung the bat again and again. I knew if he didn't stop, he was going to kill Hugo. I couldn't allow him to make that mistake. I made my decision and jumped onto Carmine's back. He staggered with my weight and dropped to his knees. I held on, my arms around his neck and my knees pressing into his back. He muttered something unintelligible and broke my hold on him. I fell back and hit my head on the door. Carmine turned and looked at me, but I could see immediately that the real Carmine was not inside this person. He frightened me and I ran away, into Ruben's room where I used his phone to call 911. I locked the door and prayed that Hugo would survive my husband's anger. As I cowered in the corner, my head pressed into my knees and my hands around my legs, I could hear nothing. I finally opened the door and peeked out, not seeing or hearing anything. I crept down to the open door of our bedroom and saw Hugo lying on the floor, covered in blood, breathing but unconscious. Carmine was nowhere to be seen. I got a wet cloth to put on Hugo's forehead and then quickly put on my house dress and my shoes. I went downstairs as quietly as I could and walked into the hall. I looked in the family room and saw Carmine sitting with his head down, the bat in his hands. The bat was bloody. I whispered his name, but Carmine didn't respond. I waited at the door until emergency services arrived. I let them in and led them upstairs to Hugo. They took over and I went back downstairs to wait for the police. When they came, they took Carmine and the bat and took him outside to their cruiser. They asked me only if Hugo was there with my permission, and of course, I said yes. I couldn't lie about that. I didn't realize at the time that I had just convicted my husband of assault. They asked me who Hugo was, who Carmine was, and wrote it all down. They asked me if Carmine had come upstairs and then assaulted Hugo, and I admitted that it was that way. I did tell them Carmine found me in bed with Hugo, but they didn't seem to care. One or two of them looked at me as if I were a piece of dirt but said nothing. After that, things were all messed up. I went down to the police station, gave my statement, and then asked to see my husband. The officer disappeared, then came back and told me that my husband had refused to see me. I insisted, but he informed me that it wasn't my decision, it was Carmine's. I had called our neighbor to take care of our son who was still in school, but there was nothing else I could do if Carmine wouldn't let me. I had no choice but to go home and try to clean up the mess my infidelity had caused. I hired an attorney, one of the best in the city of Columbus. He listened to my story, said he could get Carmine off on temporary insanity based on what he saw, the number of hours he had worked, and the degree of fatigue. He called it impaired response syndrome. I was pleased, sure that Carmine would be acquitted. When the prosecutor asked me to testify against Carmine, I refused. He threatened to subpoena me, but I still refused. I had the law on my side. I couldn't be forced to testify against my husband, and I wouldn't. During this time, the only things that kept me sane were taking care of my son and the need to fight for my husband's freedom. I was constantly talking to either the lawyers or the cops or anyone else who needed information. I took actions to free up our money for his defense, posted his bond when my attorney got him bail, and made myself ready for trial and the fight of my life. My guilt was put on the back burner with my fight for Carmine. I couldn't let myself feel the pain he was in. I had no time for recriminations. I had to get Carmine out and back home with me and Ruben. That was my purpose in life now and my fight. Later, I could try to save my marriage. Then my attorney told me Carmine refused bond. I asked how that was possible, and he told me it was Carmine's right to refuse bond. Few people did, but it was their right. All he had to do was not agree to the conditions of release. Bond was revoked, and he stayed in jail. Next, when my attorney went to see him, Carmine fired him. He asked for and received a court-appointed attorney. His money was frozen as a result of his arrest, so he qualified for the court-appointed lawyer. Finally, Carmine refused to speak to me at any time, and I was refused admittance to the jail. I couldn't see him or speak to him or help him in any way. He closed me out. I went home the day he told the jailers that I was not to be admitted to his cell or to visit with him at any time. I went home, went upstairs to the spare bedroom, and sat down on the bed. I sat there for the longest time before the tears started, and once they came with a vengeance. I cried for the next 2 days, unable to function. My guilt, the guilt I had so successfully suppressed for so long, came out, and it devastated me. I knew what I had done. I remembered the pain I saw in Carmine's eyes that day as they led him away. I knew the loneliness that my son and I would feel from this day forward. And I knew that the fault lay directly at my feet. I got up 2 days later and cleaned myself up. I had to collect my son from Carmine's sister. She had been keeping him while I fought to save Carmine. I had to tell her that I failed, and I had to endure the shame that I would feel as I faced her. She knew what I did. I had no choice but to tell her why Carmine was in jail and what forced him to do what he did. Her reaction was not what I expected. She didn't yell at me, scorn me, blame, and chastise me. All she did was ask what she could do to help me. I asked her at that time to take Ruben, and she did so without question. He had been with her since that horrible day. Now it was time for him to come home. I had resigned my job, of course. I couldn't work there anymore. Even if Hugo was in the hospital, it was not possible for me to be anywhere he was likely to show up. He was no longer a part of my life. Maybe it was too late, but it had to be. I didn't hate him, since it takes two to tango. I did blame him, as much as I blamed myself. We both knew what we were doing. I risked my marriage and my home. He risked nothing. What happened was a freak, an accident of timing. Why I had allowed it to go forward was still a mystery to me, and one for which I could find no satisfactory answer. It just was, and regret would not change it. I truly felt nothing for Hugo, and I loved my husband. I always would. That never changed, and it wasn't going to. I had screwed up, but I still loved Carmine with all my heart. He would be happy to know the pain I was going through, knowing that I had lost him by my own actions. He would be so happy. Ruben came home and I began the process of living my life without my husband. I still had hopes that he would get out soon, even if he wouldn't let me help him. Ruben knew that his father was in jail, and he knew why, but not what provoked the attack. I would tell him soon, but not now. He was too young to understand and too young to have to bear that weight. I got him back in school and tried to make things as normal for him as possible. It was hard, but I kept it on the positive side. Time was all I had now. Time to think of what I did, what Carmine was going through, and time until Carmine was home again. I was surprised a week later when I went to the jail to see if Carmine needed anything. He still wouldn't see me or speak to me, but the guards would deliver messages, and I just asked them to ask him if he needed anything from home. That day, when I spoke to the guard, he seemed surprised that I was there. "Hello, Mrs. Montoya. What are you doing here today?" "Hello, Fred. Can you see if my husband needs anything from home? I know I've asked before, but he may have found something he needs." "Not likely. He's been moved to the penitentiary in Youngstown. He got a deal and he's begun serving his time. 7 to 10. Sent there 2 days ago." "You didn't know?" No, I didn't know. No one told me. He had been moved? Accepted a deal? Why would he do that? He could have been found innocent, or at least sent to a hospital for a short stay then released. Why would he accept a deal? I turned and blindly walked out the door, understanding that my husband had decided to deal with his future without me or our son. How could he be so cruel, especially to Ruben, his only son? Me, I understood. His anger at me was too new and too raw. But his son? I called my lawyer, the one that Carmine refused, and asked him to find out what happened. He called back later that day and told me Carmine had pleaded guilty, took a reduction to simple assault, and got 7 to 10 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. He spoke to Carmine's court-appointed lawyer, and he told him that Carmine refused any appeal or any other chance at a reduced sentence. He began serving his sentence on Monday of this week. That was when I gave up hope. Now it was real. My husband was not coming home anytime soon. I was truly alone now. Alone with my son, Carmine's son. He was all I had. And my memories. Those memories made my nights hell. My son helped during the day, but at night in my bed, alone, the memories came. It's amazing how the mind keeps going back over those memories that cause us pain. I remembered Carmine standing there, and the look on his face when he found me with Hugo. I remembered him sitting there with the bat in his hand and the blank look on his face. I remembered the dead look in his eyes as the police led him away. I didn't remember Hugo or him screwing me at all. That was a blank. So much for that. A week after Carmine began serving his sentence, I had a new bed delivered and the old one taken away. Sleeping in that bed with my memories of what I had done gave me too many sleepless nights, and the relief that brought was a blessing for a few days. In addition, I had the house appraised and a realtor draw up a plan just in case. I was living on the money left in the checking and savings accounts, but I would soon need a job to begin bringing money in. During this time, Hugo recovered and he asked me to come see him. I went, just to make sure he knew we were no longer working together and that he was no longer welcome in my home or in my life. As we talked, Hugo made it clear to me that he expected me to continue to be his sex toy, or he would sue Carmine in civil court for damages. He said that unless I did, he would make sure Carmine never had a dime to his name once he got out. He laughed as he told me this. I listened, shocked at the scumsucker he was. How had I never noticed this before? When Hugo was done with his threat, I stood up, looked him directly in the eye, and threatened to sue him for sexual harassment and unwanted sexual advances. He laughed, but I made it clear I was dead serious. I reached for the phone beside his bed and asked him if I should call my lawyer now. He sputtered and argued with me, but finally agreed to not pursue it any further. I put the phone down, and as I walked out of the room, he gave it one last try. "I promise you this, you little bitch. When he does get out, I'll make it my business to know. I'll wait until he begins to work, and then I'll sue his bum in civil court for every penny he makes for the rest of his sad, pathetic life. He'll be sorry he ever raised his hand to me. And what will be even better is that you won't be able to do a damn thing, since it will be all past history. But not my injuries." I continued out the door, believing his words were just bravado. Almost a year later, I made a decision to begin my life without Carmine. I had no choice, as he made it clear. Although I didn't want it, I decided to file for divorce, sell the house, and buy something much smaller for Ruben and me. There was far more than enough money in the house and the insurance policy if I managed it properly. I wanted to be certain I had enough for Ruben's college fund. That was not negotiable. I also searched the want ads and found a job working as a receptionist in a small veterinary clinic. It was a good job. The people were nice and the money was enough combined with what I had to keep us comfortable. I wrote Carmine a letter to be delivered with the divorce petition, asking him to speak with me and let me explain why I was filing. It was only because I had to provide for Ruben and me while Carmine was gone, but I also hoped it would allow me to see if there was any way we could still go on as a family. I held my breath until the note I sent was returned with Carmine's congratulations for my new life with my lover, Hugo. He also told me that everything we had was mine and he wanted nothing. He would agree to whatever terms I worked out, but he wanted to be free of me. I had expected nothing else, but to see it written out in his own handwriting was so damned final. I lost it then. I couldn't help myself. I spent the next day in tears, much as I had in the days after I cheated him. After I had gotten that out of my system, I wrote a small note to be delivered to him telling him that Hugo and I never spoke after that day and that I no longer worked for the same company. It was futile and would make no difference, but I couldn't let him go on believing Hugo was part of his son's life. I made sure that the prison doctor would make sure he read it. That was all I could do. But I had to move forward to provide for me and for our son. Once the divorce was final, I sold the house, not without some regret. It was worth quite a bit and I took 3/4 of that and deposited it into a separate account for Carmine. He didn't have to know about it until he was released. I owed him that. I found a small bungalow just right for Ruben and I, close to the vet clinic where I worked and bought it outright. I wouldn't have to worry about making mortgage payments. I enrolled Ruben in school, and he quickly made friends and began to adjust. He had stopped asking about his father when I convinced him that Carmine was gone and too far away to see us. We began our life over and time passed. It was several years later that Ruben mentioned Carmine. When he was 12, he asked me why his father was in prison. It was a question he had continued to ask, and I continued to try to avoid telling him the truth. I tried to skim over it with platitudes, much as I had been doing for several years, but this time, he would not let it go. Someone had told him that his father was in the penitentiary for almost killing a man, and Ruben wanted to know the details. I decided it was time. I sat him down and told him the complete truth, not sparing myself in the details. Ruben listened closely, remained quiet after I had finished, and then simply said, "I don't blame Dad for doing what he did. He had to do it." Then he walked away and never mentioned it again. I expected recriminations from him, but none came. He simply accepted it and went on. Or so I thought. Now let's listen the story from Ruben's perspective. When I was in the 7th grade, Eddie, my best friend, told me he found a clipping in his mother's stuff that told about my dad being arrested for assault with intent to kill some man. I didn't want to believe it, but he showed me the clipping. I read it over twice, and it was true. My dad was arrested after almost killing some guy with my baseball bat. It happened when I was 9, and that was the last time I saw him. He must have gone to jail right away because I remember he never came home after that. At the time, Mom wouldn't tell me what happened and said it would have to wait till I was older. I kept the clipping, and when I went home that night, I asked her straight out to tell me what happened. She wasn't going to do it, but I kept it her till she made me sit down, and then she told me the whole story. She said it was all her fault, and it was because she made a very bad mistake. She was in bed with her old boss when Dad came home and saw them together. She said he had a breakdown, whatever that was, but that it wasn't Dad's fault. He had been working at the hospital for over 30 hours without sleep, and he wasn't himself that day. She said when he walked in and saw them together, he just snapped. He took my baseball bat and hit the man several times before she made him stop. She said the man recovered without any problems, but that Dad was so upset that he had hurt someone that he couldn't get over it and wanted to pay the price. She told me she tried to get him off with a lesser sentence, but Dad was too angry to accept her help and wanted nothing to do with her after what he saw. Instead, he insisted that he was guilty, and they sent him to prison for 7 years. I listened, understanding what it was she did. I read stories and I saw what people did on the internet. I knew she had sex with that other man, and I knew that meant she had cheated on my dad. She admitted it and didn't try to worm out of it. I thought that was pretty cool of her, even if it did make me mad at her. I asked why he wouldn't see us, and she said it was because he was too proud to have me see him in jail like that. When I asked if she ever went, she looked very sad when she said Dad wouldn't talk to her at all. He hadn't spoken to her since that day he saw her with that other man. I asked her why he wouldn't talk to her, and all she said was that Dad couldn't forgive her for what she did to him. She said he was hurt very much and that he wanted to forget about her. She didn't say he wanted to forget about me, so I filed that away for later. After I thought about what Mom told me, I decided that it was the reason I would hear her cry sometimes late at night. I knew she missed my dad because I could hear her talk to Aunt Eileen about it. Aunt Eileen was still friends with me and Mom even after Mom hurt Dad, who was Aunt Eileen's brother. I heard Mom tell her one day that she had some pictures of me she wanted Eileen to send to Dad. Eileen said she would do that. I felt better that my dad would know what I looked like. I hoped I looked like him. I didn't say any more about it to Mom, and I let her think I had forgotten all about it, but I hadn't. I talked to Eddie about it, and he suggested I talk to one of my teachers, one that I liked real well and who treated us kids like adults. He was cool and I knew I could trust him. I told him where my dad was and I asked him how I could get in touch with him. He told me he would check into it and get back to me. It was a week later when he called me to stay after class. He told me then who to call for information. I thanked him and began to make my plan. Eddie came up with this idea that I buy one of those cheap phones that you could buy almost anywhere. He said all I had to do was pay for it up front, and I would then have so many minutes to use before it was time to either buy more or just throw it away. I had enough money saved up to do it, so we went to the CVS and bought one. I waited until I was alone and called the Department of Corrections in Columbus and asked for information about Carmine Montoya. When they asked my relationship, I told them I was his son and I was 18. They believed me and gave me the information. I knew where he was and how to call at the prison, but when I did call, they said that Dad had left clear instructions on who he would accept calls from. I wasn't on the list. They refused to talk to him for me, so I asked them if I could still call for information about him. They said I could. After that, I called every few months to see if he had changed his mind, or if they might have said something to him, but nothing changed. It remained that way for the next 2 years, the time between my calls getting longer and longer with each failure to talk to him. That was until the day I called on my 15th birthday. That was the day they told me that my dad had been released on parole a month ago. He was out of prison. He was free. That was the best birthday present I could have wished for. When I asked if they had a number where I could reach him, they gave me one. I had a number to call to reach my dad. I decided that I wouldn't tell Mom. She would try to stop me from contacting him. I knew that for sure. She would tell me it would hurt him if I were to call him. He wanted us to go on without him, she said. I heard her, but I wouldn't accept that. No way. Not my dad. I was going to talk to him if it killed me. And anyway, she was the one sending him my pictures, so he had to think about me when he got them. So there. I called the number they gave me and I got this man who said he was Dad's parole officer. After I told him who I was and that I wanted to talk to my dad, he said he would get in touch with Dad and tell him. But he told me it was Dad's decision if he wanted to call me back. I did understand what he told me, but I could hope. I gave him the number and he promised he would call Dad and let him know it was me. I hung up and felt excited now. I was close to talking with my dad. I hadn't seen him since I was a little kid and I really missed him. I could still remember him coming in my room at night and kissing my forehead. Sissy stuff, but I loved it. I never told anyone, but I did. It was a week later, a week that seemed like it took forever to me, that I got a call on my cell phone. I still had it and kept it turned on and charged even though I never used it to call anyone else. It was just for my dad. I was walking home, my friend Eddie with me when it rang. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, paralyzed. It was Dad. He called me. What do? I stood there stupidly staring at Eddie until he said, "Answer it, stupid." "Hello?" I held my breath. "Hello, is this Ruben? Ruben Montoya?" The voice was deep, sort of soft but clear. I would have known that voice anywhere. I heard it sometimes in my dreams. It was him. "Dad? Is it really you?" "Yeah, it's me. Does your mom know you called me? Is she there now?" "No, I got a cheap phone. You know the ones you just buy and activate? She doesn't even know I have this one. I was afraid you'd call when I was home. I didn't tell her I was going to call you. Actually, I've been calling the prison for the last year or so, just waiting for you to be let go. They wouldn't let me talk to you or even give you a message, so I called every few months." "Who gave you my PO's number?" "What's a PO?" "He's my parole officer, the one you called." "Who gave you his number?" "The prison." "Dad, where are you? Are you coming home now that you're out?" Ruben, that's no longer my home. Your mother and I are divorced, and it's for the best. She's moved on now, and that's how it should be. You know that. That's not true, Dad. She never goes out on dates, and she never sees any men. She still cries at night sometimes, and she's sorry for what she did. She misses you, I know. She doesn't talk about you, but that's just to make it easier on me. She told me what she did, and she made a mistake. You have to come back. You have to. No, Ruben, I don't have to. It's better for both of you if I'm out of the picture.